Welcome to your review of sports and performance nutrition for team sport athletes. Those sports where you're out there on the field or the court or the ice
Mm.
with your teammates, battling it out. Think football, basketball, soccer, all about, coordinated effort and strategy. Now, you probably already have a pretty good grasp of the basics of sports nutrition, but this deep dive is about uncovering the subtle details and practical tips that can really make a difference in a team's performance.
What's interesting here, I think, is we're not just talking about like individual athletes pushing their own limits. We're looking at how to fuel a whole group of people, each with their own, roles and energy demands to work together effectively.
It's like fine-tuning a high-performance engine.
Right.
Each part needs to be running smoothly for the whole system to function at its best. So let's start with the fuel itself. What are the energy needs of team sport athletes?
Well, just like with any athlete, their needs can vary quite a bit. The specific demands of the sport, the different positions within a team, and each player's size. It all plays a role. For instance, a midfielder in soccer is constantly on the move, covering a lot of ground, while a goalkeeper might have bursts of intense activity, but spends a good portion of the game relatively stationary.
So it's not as simple as saying all soccer players need X amount of calories. It's about tailoring those recommendations to the individual's role on the team.
Precisely. And while we tend to think of athletes needing to constantly refuel during competition, that's not always the case, especially for games that last 1 to 2 hours. Those athletes have likely gone into the game with enough stored energy to perform well.
So no need to be chugging sugary drinks every 5 minutes.
It's going to be depending.
It goes against what a lot of sports drink commercials might lead you to believe.
Exactly. The way we calculate energy expenditure for team sport athletes is actually pretty similar to how we do it for other athletes. You already know the basics of that, so we don't need to spend too much time there. But where things get really interesting is when we start talking about carbohydrates.
Because carbs are the primary fuel source for those quick bursts of intense activity that are so common in team sports.
Yeah, you got it. Think about a basketball player sprinting down the court or a football player making a tackle. Those explosive movements rely heavily on what we call anaerobic metabolism, which primarily uses carbohydrates for energy.
So if I'm a coach trying to fuel my team for success, how many carbs should my players be aiming for each day? Is there a magic number?
Well, there's no single magic number, but a good starting point is 6 to 10 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight each day. That translates to roughly 55 to 65% of their total calorie intake.
Okay, so a significant portion of their diet should be coming from carbs. But it's not just about the amount.
Right.
Timing also plays a crucial role.
Absolutely. Let's take that pregame meal, for instance. Topping off those glycogen stores and keeping blood sugar levels stable before competition is key. We recommend aiming for 1 to 4 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight, consumed 1 to 4 hours before the game.
So a decent-sized meal a few hours before hitting the field. I know when I used to play, those pregame jitters often made it really hard to stomach a big meal.
That's where liquid meals can really be a game changer. They're a great option for athletes who are feeling a little nervous because they're easier on the stomach, they digest quickly, and they still pack in all the necessary energy.
It's like a pregame power smoothie, providing those essential carbs without weighing you down.
Now, what about during the game itself? Do we need to worry about those glycogen stores becoming depleted, especially in longer games?
That's a great question. For games that are under an hour, it's unlikely that glycogen depletion is going to be a major factor. But for games that go longer, it is important to replenish those energy stores.
So what's the best way to do that? Are we talking about snack breaks on the sidelines? Not quite. It's more about incorporating small amounts of carbohydrates throughout the game. A good target is 30 to 60 grams per hour.
Okay, so not a full meal, but maybe something like half a banana and a handful of dried fruit.
Exactly. Or a cup of a 6 to 8% sports drink every 15 minutes or so. Just enough to keep those energy levels topped up without overloading the system.
What about those multi-game days where athletes might have back-to-back matches?
Those are particularly challenging from a fueling perspective. Again, liquid meals can be a real lifesaver between games. Not only do they provide energy, but they also contribute to rehydration, which is essential for recovery.
Speaking of recovery, let's talk about that crucial window right after a game. What's the golden rule for replenishing those depleted glycogen stores?
The key is to start replenishing those carbs as soon as possible after exercise. Ideally, aim for 1 to 1.2 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight every hour for the first 4 hours after exercise.
So having high-carb snacks and drinks readily available as soon as they step off the field is crucial.
Absolutely. It's all about kickstarting that recovery process and setting the stage for optimal performance in the next game.
Okay, so we've got our energy needs covered. What about protein? We always hear about how important it is for athletes, but does it play a different role for team sport athletes compared to, say, a bodybuilder?
It's definitely essential, but its role is primarily focused on muscle repair and adaptation to training, rather than being a primary fuel source during competition.
So the idea that team sport athletes need to be consuming mountains of protein is a myth.
For the most part, yes. The recommended range for team sport athletes is 1.2 to 2.0 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. That's about 15 to 20% of their total calorie intake.
Got it. So a moderate amount of protein spread throughout the day. But what about that post-exercise protein window? Is it as important as everyone says?
Well, studies have shown that consuming even a small amount of essential amino acids, about 10 grams, can actually stimulate muscle protein synthesis.
So how much protein do athletes need to consume to get those 10 grams of essential amino acids?
A serving of 15 to 25 grams of complete protein, like a chicken breast or a protein shake, should do the trick. And ideally, this protein intake should be combined with carbs within 1 to 2 hours after exercise for optimal recovery.
So it's about getting that balance of carbs and protein post-exercise to jumpstart recovery. Now let's talk about fats. Where do they fit into the picture for team sport athletes?
Fats is where things get a little more nuanced. How much fat an athlete utilizes for energy really depends on the specific sport and the length of the competition.
So a basketball player, with its quick bursts of energy, might rely on fat differently than a soccer player who's constantly moving for longer periods.
Exactly. But in general, the overall dietary fat composition shouldn't differ significantly from recommendations for other athletes, which around 20 to 35% of total calorie intake.
Okay, so a moderate amount of fat is key. But what are some good sources of healthy fats that athletes should be including in their diets?
Foods like salmon, avocado, almonds, and olive oil are all great choices. They not only provide energy, but they also offer a variety of other health benefits.
So it's about building a balanced plate, making sure each macronutrient, carbs, protein, and fats is represented in the right proportions. What about vitamins and minerals? Do team sport athletes have different needs compared to the general population?
In most cases, their vitamin and mineral needs are similar to those of other active individuals. And the good news is that most athletes who are meeting their energy needs are also likely getting enough vitamins and minerals through a balanced diet.
So food first, supplements second.
Exactly. However, it's worth noting that some team sport athletes might have lower intakes of certain nutrients like vitamins A, E, and folate, and the mineral iron. This is where paying attention to food choices and potentially working with a registered dietitian can be really helpful.
It's like a checkup for your diet, making sure you're not missing out on any essential nutrients. So we've covered energy needs, carbs, protein, fats, and vitamins and minerals. Is there anything else we need to consider when it comes to fueling team sport athletes for success?
We can't forget about hydration. It's absolutely critical, especially considering that a lot of team sports are played outdoors in hot and humid conditions or in, poorly ventilated gyms. Dehydration can seriously impact performance.
All right, let's dive into hydration. What are the key things athletes and coaches need to know to keep those fluid levels topped up?
Well, before we even think about game day, it's really about those good habits, you know? Athletes should be aiming for around 2 cups of fluid 2 to 3 hours before a practice or game, and then another cup maybe 10 to 20 minutes before they actually go out there.
So starting the hydration process well before the action even begins. That makes sense. But what about during the game itself? How do you keep players hydrated when they're so focused on, the competition?
I think consistency is really key here. Encourage athletes to have a cup of fluid every 10 to 20 minutes during the game. Now, I know that might sound like a lot, and some athletes might worry about feeling, sloshy or bloated.
Yeah, I can imagine some players would really resist that, especially if they're in the zone.
And that's where coaching and education are really important. It's about, explaining the science behind hydration and showing them how it directly affects their performance. When athletes understand that dehydration can lead to fatigue, decreased coordination, even muscle cramps, they're a lot more likely to prioritize those fluid breaks.
It's about making hydration like a performance strategy, not just another chore.
Exactly. And remember, individual needs can vary a lot. It depends on things like sweat rate, body size, and of course the weather conditions. Some athletes might naturally sweat more than others, so they'll need to adjust their fluid intake based on that.
So it's not like a one-size-fits-all approach. Each athlete needs to kind of pay attention to their own body's signals. Now, what about recovery? How does hydration play into, replenishing those fluids lost during a game?
Rehydrating after a game is just as important as hydrating before and during. Think of it like refueling your car after a long drive. You wouldn't hit the road again with an empty tank, would you?
Definitely not. So what's the best strategy for post-game rehydration then?
A good rule of thumb is to consume about 2 to 3 cups of fluid for every pound of body weight lost during exercise. And this is where monitoring body weight before and after a practice or a competition can be really helpful. It gives you a tangible measure of fluid loss, and it helps guide those rehydration efforts.
It's like a personalized hydration roadmap.
Exactly. And it's not just about water either. Electrolyte drinks, like sports drinks, can be really helpful for replenishing electrolytes lost through sweat, especially after intense or prolonged exercise.
Okay, so we've talked about the science of hydration and the importance of pre, during, and post-game fluid intake. But let's get practical here. Are there any tricks of the trade that coaches can use to actually encourage their athletes to stay hydrated, especially when they're, in the heat of competition?
Absolutely. One simple trick is to just make hydration more appealing. Offer a variety of different fluid choices like water, sports drinks, and even diluted juice. Some athletes might find plain water a little bit boring, so giving them some options can make a big difference.
It's like creating a hydration buffet.
Exactly. And keep those fluids cold. A chilled drink is always more refreshing, especially on a hot day. Another tip is to actually schedule short fluid breaks every 15 to 20 minutes during practice and games. This creates a built-in opportunity for athletes to grab a quick drink and refocus.
So incorporating hydration into the routine rather than making it an afterthought.
Right. And don't underestimate the power of those visual cues. Provide each athlete with their own water bottle so they can track their intake. You can even get creative with it, like marking the bottle with little time goals or something like that.
That's a great idea. It turns hydration into a little bit of a game. Now let's switch gears a bit and talk about meal planning, which could be a real challenge for team sports, especially when those teams are on the road.
It can definitely feel like a logistical puzzle, especially when you're trying to manage, a whole team's worth of appetites and different dietary needs.
Where do you even begin when it comes to planning meals for a team that's on the go?
Well, the first thing to remember is that packing food for road trips is often the best way to go. You have more control over the quality and types of food that your athletes are eating, and it can be more cost-effective than, relying on restaurants or concession stands.
Makes sense. But packing food for a whole team sounds like a logistical nightmare all on its own.
It definitely requires some organization. A good place to start is to check with the hotels or schools ahead of time to see what amenities they have. Do they have refrigerators or microwaves that you can use?
So you don't end up with, a cooler full of perishable food and nowhere to store it.
Exactly. And of course, make sure you have plenty of water and sports drinks packed. Planning those food stops ahead of time can also save a lot of stress. Look for restaurants along your route that offer, healthier options and make a plan for where you're going to stop for meals.
It's like mapping out a culinary road trip.
I like that. And when you are packing food, think about a balance of perishable and non-perishable items.
Okay, let's break that down. What are some examples of perishable foods that athletes could take on the road?
Perishable items are those that need to be kept cold, to be safe to eat. Think sports drinks, bottled water, yogurt, low-fat cheese sticks, deli meats, hard-boiled eggs, fresh fruit. These are all good options for providing nutrients and energy, but you'll need a cooler and some ice packs to keep them fresh.
Those are all good choices. But what about foods that don't need refrigeration? What are some non-perishable options that travel well?
Non-perishable foods are a lifesaver for travel because they can be kept at room temperature without spoiling. Things like graham crackers, vanilla wafers, whole grain crackers, pretzels, cereal bars, granola bars, dried fruit, nuts. All good choices.
Those are all great for snacking on the bus or, between games. But what about when you're stuck with whatever's available, like at a concession stand or a fast food restaurant? How do you make healthier choices when you're in those situations?
Making healthy choices when you're eating out can be a little tricky, but it's definitely doable. If you're at a fast food restaurant, look for grilled or baked options instead of fried foods. Choose lean meats like chicken or fish and load up on veggies whenever you can.
So it's about being mindful of the menu and, making those informed choices.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to customize your order. Ask for your burger without the cheese or mayo, or maybe swap out those fries for a side salad. And if you're at a buffet, start by filling your plate with, vegetables, lean protein, and whole grains. Then, if you still have room, you can always go back for a smaller portion of something more indulgent.
It's all about balance and portion control.
Right. And speaking of control, let's talk about competition day eating. What are some key things that athletes should keep in mind when it comes to fueling up for game day?
This is where the rubber really meets the road.
Right.
What's the best pre-game meal strategy?
For events that are 1 to 3 hours long, a large meal right before competing isn't really necessary, and it might actually hurt performance. The focus should really be on making sure that athletes are well fueled and hydrated going into the game.
So what does that look like, practically speaking?
It's about having a balanced meal a few hours before the game, something that provides, carbohydrates for energy, protein for muscle support, and healthy fats for satiety. Think about a turkey sandwich on whole grain bread, a bowl of oatmeal with some fruit and nuts, or maybe a chicken stir fry with brown rice.
Those are all great examples. But what about athletes who tend to get nervous before games and have trouble eating a full meal?
Liquid meals or smoothies can be a really good alternative. They're easy to digest, provide that good balance of nutrients, and can actually help settle those pregame nerves.
And they can be customized to, each athlete's taste, which is always a plus.
Absolutely. Now, while eating during competition isn't really as critical for those shorter events, snacking between games is really essential, especially for things like tournaments or those multi-game days.
So what kind of snacks should athletes be going for in between games?
The goal is to replenish energy and provide nutrients to help with recovery. Low-fat, high-carb, moderate protein snacks are what you're looking for. Think trail mix, fruit with yogurt, a whole grain bagel with peanut butter, or a turkey wrap with some veggies.
Those are all great options. But what about those times when you know the only option is the concession stand? What are some healthier choices that athletes can make in those situations?
Well, if you're stuck with concession stand fare, try to avoid those overly processed or fried foods. Look for things like fruit cups, yogurt parfaits, pretzels, or even just a plain hamburger or chicken sandwich.
So basically just making the best choices that you can given the options that you have.
Exactly. And, encourage those athletes to pack their own snacks whenever they can. That way they have more control over, the quality and types of foods that they're eating.
Makes sense. Now, before we wrap up this segment, let's touch on a really crucial part of team nutrition, especially when traveling: food safety.
Food safety is so important, especially when you're responsible for a whole team's health. You don't want a foodborne illness, derailing your season.
Definitely not. So what are some key food safety tips that coaches and athletes should keep in mind?
Well, the basics are always a good place to start. Wash hands thoroughly before handling any food. Keep perishable foods refrigerated at 40 degrees Fahrenheit or colder. And heat hot foods to 140 degrees Fahrenheit or warmer.
Those are good reminders for everybody, not just athletes. Are there any specific considerations for, teams, especially when they're traveling?
I think when you're traveling, it's crucial to be super careful about food storage and handling. Make sure you have enough coolers and ice packs to keep those perishable foods cold, and be mindful of what we call the temperature danger zone when you're transporting food.
So no leaving those sandwiches sitting out on the bus for hours on end.
Exactly. And always check those expiration dates on the food, especially if you're packing snacks or meals ahead of time.
Great tips. Any other advice for keeping teams safe and healthy when they're on the road?
One aspect of food safety that often gets overlooked is managing food allergies. Always have a list of athletes with food allergies and make sure to communicate those allergies clearly to any restaurants or food providers.
That's so important for preventing those, accidental exposures.
Absolutely. And encourage athletes to be proactive about managing their own food allergies. Teach them to read labels carefully, ask questions about ingredients, and avoid any foods they're unsure about.
So empowering athletes to kind of be their own food safety advocates.
Exactly. Food safety is a team effort, and when everyone works together, you can really minimize those risks and keep everyone healthy and energized, throughout the season.
Okay, so we've covered so much in terms of fueling those team sport athletes for success, everything from the importance of hydration and the role of each macronutrient to the logistics of meal planning and food safety.
Yeah, it's been a pretty comprehensive journey, hasn't it? Through the world of team nutrition.
But before we wrap things up, I'd love to hear your thoughts on one final topic. As our listeners consider the nutrition practices of their own teams or teams that they follow, what's one thing that you would want them to think about?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it would be fascinating for listeners to consider how these principles that we've talked about today could be applied even beyond just elite athletics.
What do you mean by that?
Well, we've been talking about fueling athletes for, optimal performance, but these principles of balanced nutrition, hydration, and food safety are really relevant for everybody, regardless of their athletic ability.
So even those of us who aren't, competing at a professional level can benefit from these insights.
Absolutely. Whether you're a weekend warrior, a recreational athlete, or just someone who wants to feel their best, these same principles can help you achieve your goals.
That's a great reminder that taking care of our bodies through proper nutrition is really a lifelong journey.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be complicated either. Start by focusing on those small, sustainable changes that you can incorporate into your daily routine.
What kind of changes are we talking about?
Well, things like making sure you're drinking enough water throughout the day, choosing nutrient-rich foods over those processed snacks, and prioritizing meal planning so you can avoid those last-minute unhealthy choices.
Small changes that can add up to make a big difference over time.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to seek guidance from those qualified professionals like registered dietitians or sports nutritionists. They can help you create a personalized plan that meets your individual needs and goals.
So it's really about taking ownership of our health and well-being.
I couldn't have said it better myself. It's about making those informed choices that support our bodies and our minds, both on and off the field.
This deep dive has been incredibly insightful, and I'm sure our listeners are walking away with a ton of knowledge and practical tips that they can use in their own lives.
I hope so. It's been great sharing my insights with you and your listeners.
The pleasure was all mine. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into sports and performance nutrition for team sport athletes. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep diving deep.
See you next time. It's been really interesting talking about all of this stuff. It's amazing how even on the same team, you can have such a wide range of, individual needs.
That's a good point. We've talked about these general guidelines, but how do we actually practically make sure that those guidelines are actually being met for each individual player? When you think about a basketball team, a power forward's going to have different demands than a point guard, even though they're on the same team.
Yeah. Individualization is really important, and that's where communication between coaches and athletes, and if they have access to one, a registered dietitian is super valuable. Athletes need to feel comfortable talking to their coaches about their dietary needs and preferences and any allergies or intolerances they have and how their training schedule is impacting, their energy levels and things like that.
So it's about creating a team environment where nutrition is really viewed as a performance tool and people feel comfortable discussing it.
Exactly. And from a coaching perspective, it's about, moving away from that one-size-fits-all approach to nutrition.
Yeah.
Giving athletes the resources and support that they need to make good decisions about their diets can make a really big difference in their performance and their overall well-being.
It's about empowering athletes to take control of their nutrition rather than just handing them a sheet of paper with a generic meal plan and saying, okay, go follow this.
Absolutely, yeah. It's about education and collaboration and recognizing that, each athlete brings something different to the table. When you create that kind of environment, well, you have a team where everyone's really invested in their health and performance.
Well said. This deep dive has been really insightful. I think our listeners are definitely walking away with a much better understanding of sports nutrition for team sport athletes. We've covered everything from the basics of energy balance and macronutrients to hydration, meal planning, even food safety.
We've really dug deep, haven't we? And I think one of the big things people should remember is the importance of timing when it comes to nutrition. It's not just what athletes eat, it's also when they eat it.
Right. Strategically timing those meals and snacks to really optimize energy levels and support recovery and ultimately enhance performance.
Exactly. And while we've talked about team sports specifically, a lot of these principles can be applied to anyone, really. Anyone who's looking to improve their performance, whether it's athletic performance or just their overall health.
It's a good reminder that we should all be taking care of our bodies
Mm.
and that proper nutrition is a lifelong thing, whether we're professional athletes or just trying to, live a good life.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's all about giving our bodies the fuel they need at the right times so we can achieve our goals, whatever those goals might be.
This has been a fantastic conversation. I know our listeners are going to benefit from all your insights. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into sports and performance nutrition for team sport athletes.
It's been my pleasure.
And to all our listeners, thank you for diving deep with us. We'll be back soon with another episode where we'll be exploring a brand new topic. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and keep striving for peak performance in everything you do.